He was a hated, forgotten prisoner, written off and left with no freedom, no voice, and no hope. His king Ahab had promised him nothing but bread, water, and the cold stones of a dungeon. But that silence was about to be broken. He could have stayed quiet, echoed the lies of 400 men to buy his safety in a broken system. But he refused. In a stunning act of integrity, he stood before the most powerful man in the nation, took a daring risk, and confronted the crown that had tried to bury him. And in doing so, he became the unlikely hero of a story that would expose the darkness of a kingdom and prove that God's truth cannot be imprisoned. This is not merely a story of political tension. It is a story of shocking conviction, strategic boldness, and the courage of a man who risked everything not for rebellion, but for the word of the Lord. This is the story of Micaiah and the king. Our story begins with a divided land and a king who has forgotten who he serves. Ahab, a leader among his people, makes a decision that will change the direction of his life and lead him toward a final, fatal judgment. In the heart of Samaria, the sun blazed against the ivory palace, a monument to King Ahab's defiant wealth and earthly power. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive incense and the tension of a world-shaping decision. Ahab, a man defined by his broad-shouldered arrogance and a crown, heavy with blood-red jewels, sat upon his throne like a predator contemplating its next move. He was a leader used to being obeyed, his rigid posture and crossed arms signaling a soul that had long ago traded spiritual heritage for Canaanite alliances. Beside him sat King Jehoshaphat of Judah, draped in regal purple and gold, a man of different stock who found himself at a dangerous crossroads. The two kings looked out over a sea of golden luxury, the very picture of an unbreakable alliance. Ahab spoke with a voice like grinding stone, proposing a joint strike to reclaim Ramoth-Gilead. "Will you go with me to battle?" he demanded, his eyes flashing with the impatience of a man who viewed his will as law. Jehoshaphat, though wary, gave his word. "I am as you are, my people as your people." It was a moment of political triumph for Ahab, a cementing of human strength against a common foe. Yet even amidst the shimmering embroidery and ornamental clasps, a shadow lingered. The Bible records how the patriarchs before them sought the Lord. But here, in this room of gold and pride, Ahab relied on his own might and the flatteries of his court. The alliance was set, the war was planned, and the stage was perfectly arranged for a collision between the grand illusions of kings and the inconvenient reality of a single humble truth. But the solemnity of the king's alliance was soon drowned out by a cacophony of manufactured divinity. At Ahab's command, the gates of the court swung open, and 400 prophets flooded the stone plaza like a rising tide of choreographed zeal. These were not men of the wilderness or the quiet whisper. They were creatures of the palace, dressed in fine linens that mirrored the king's own decadence. They did not seek the mind of God. They sought the smile of the man on the throne. The air grew thick with a symphony of lies as the prophets began their theatrical performance, swaying and shouting in a frantic rhythmic unison. At the center of this spiritual spectacle stood Zedekiah, a man who understood that in Ahab's court, the loudest voice was often mistaken for the truest. With a flourish of dramatic flair, he produced a pair of iron horns, brandishing them before the two kings like a weapon of war. "With these," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the ivory walls, "you shall gore the Arameans until they are consumed." It was a masterpiece of state-sponsored deception, a constant stream of yes man, encouragement designed to bolster Ahab's pride and silence any lingering doubt in Jehoshaphat's heart. The 400 voices rose into a singular roar, promising victory, glory, and the favor of a God they had remade in the king's image. Yet, beneath the clashing of iron and the feverish cries, the atmosphere remained hollow. This was not prophecy. It was a performance. Amidst the golden lighting and the ancient stone architecture, the theatrical horns of Zedekiah gleamed with a false promise, setting a stage of grand delusion that only a fearless voice of truth could shatter. While the courtyard vibrated with the manufactured roar of the 400, the atmosphere within the palace shifted. King Jehoshaphat, unsettled by the theatrical horns and the too-perfect consensus, leaned toward Ahab and asked for a voice not yet heard. Ahab's face darkened, his brow furrowing with a deep-seated bitterness. "There is still one man," Ahab muttered, "but I hate him for he never prophesies good concerning me, but always evil." This was the reputation of Micaiah, a man whose name was synonymous with royal discomfort and unyielding truth. A messenger was dispatched to the dark, quiet corners of the city to summon the prophet from his latest imprisonment. As they hurried back toward the ivory palace, the messenger leaned in, his voice a frantic whisper of friendly advice. "Look," he urged. "The words of the other prophets are with one consent in favor of the king. Let your word be like theirs. Speak favorably." It was a plea for survival, a warning to conform to the system built on lies that had already consumed the court. Micaiah, a leaner man in a plain beige tunic, walked with a steady, resolute pace that contrasted the messenger's frantic energy. His softer but resolute eyes didn't flicker with fear. Instead, they held the quiet courage of a man who had already settled his soul. He had heard the symphony of lies from a distance, and he knew the cost of dissent. As he approached the golden lighting of the throne room, the messenger's warning hung in the air like a heavy shroud. But Micaiah's heart remained anchored. He was a man who refused to be bought, and as he prepared to face the defiant king, he knew that his silence was over. The one was about to speak against the 400. Micaiah stepped into the grand hall, his simple earth-toned tunic a stark contrast to the shimmering gold and deep purples of the royal assembly. The 400 prophets fell silent as he approached the two thrones, their eyes narrow with anticipation and malice. King Ahab, his arms crossed tightly against his chest, wasted no time on pleasantries. His voice, heavy with arrogance and impatience, cut through the stillness. "Micaiah, shall we go to Ramoth-Gilead to battle, or shall we refrain?" Micaiah looked at the king, then at the sea of yes-man prophets, who had just finished their theatrical display. A flicker of something unexpected crossed his face. Not fear, but a sharp, biting irony, with a sweeping gesture that perfectly mirrored the dramatic flair of the false prophets. Micaiah let out a sarcastic echo of their own hollow promises. "Go in triumph!" he exclaimed, his voice dripping with exaggerated enthusiasm. "For the Lord will give it into the hand of the king." The court froze. It was a moment of shocking boldness, a calculated mockery of the state-sponsored deception that filled the room. Micaiah was using the king's own system of flattery to expose its emptiness. Ahab, however, was not fooled. He knew the difference between a bought word and a divine one. His expression shifted from impatience to a dark, simmering rage as he realized the prophet was playing with him, mocking the very foundations of his royal power. "How many times must I make you swear?" Ahab growled, leaning forward with a stern, commanding gaze. "To tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" The game of sarcasm was over. The time for the uncomfortable truth had arrived. The sarcasm vanished from Micaiah's face, replaced by a gravity that seemed to pull the very air from the room. His eyes, once light with mockery, now burned with the terrifying clarity of a man seeing beyond the veil of the physical world. "Hear then the word of the Lord," he proclaimed, his voice no longer an echo but a trumpet blast that silenced the rustle of royal robes. In a sudden cinematic shift of atmosphere, the ivory walls of the palace seemed to dissolve, replaced by a vision of the celestial throne room. Micaiah described the Lord sitting on a throne of blinding light, with the host of heaven standing in attendance to his right and to his left. The court of Samaria gasped as the prophet unmasked the invisible forces, pulling the strings of their reality. He spoke of a divine decree. Ahab's time had run out, and the heavens were seeking a way to lure him to his fall at Ramoth-Gilead. Then, from the ranks of the spirit realm, a figure stepped forward, not a spirit of truth, but a lying spirit. "I will go," the spirit had declared, "and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." The revelation hit the 400 like a physical blow. Micaiah stood firm, his humble beige tunic shimmering in the reflected glory of his vision. As he pointed a finger at the stunned assembly, he exposed the symphony of lies not as a mere political error, but as a divine trap. The Lord had decreed disaster, and the very voices Ahab had bought and paid for were the instruments of his own destruction. The heavens had opened, and the king's fate was sealed in the mouth of a lie. The silence following Micaiah's vision lasted, only a heartbeat before the throne room erupted, in a fury of wounded pride. Zedekiah, the leader of the 400, felt the sting of the prophet's words like a brand against his skin. To have his symphony of lies exposed as a demonic snare was an insult he could not endure. Driven by a blind, defensive rage, he lunged forward. The golden lighting of the hall caught the motion of his arm as he struck Micaiah across the face, a heavy, echoing blow that sent a shockwave of stillness through the court. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go when he went from me to speak to you?" Zedekiah spat, his face contorted with the arrogance of a man who believed his own deception. Micaiah did not flinch, though the copper taste of blood filled his mouth. He stood with the same quiet courage he had carried from the dungeon, his simple beige tunic now a mark of honor against the backdrop of royal betrayal. He looked at Zedekiah with pity rather than anger. "You will find out," Micaiah answered calmly, "on the day you go to hide in an inner room." The blow was the signal for the court to turn. The air, once heavy with the presence of the divine, was now thick with the corruption of men. As the courtiers and prophets began to jeer, the mirrored poses of the two kings shifted. Ahab's face hardened into a mask of finality, his eyes signaling that the time for truth was over. Micaiah was no longer just a dissenter. He was a target. The man of truth stood alone, isolated by the very integrity that had saved his soul, while the empire closed its ranks around the lie that would lead it to the grave. Ahab's patience disintegrated, replaced by a cold surgical cruelty. He did not need to shout to convey his malice. His rigid posture and the tight crossing of his arms spoke of a king who had finally closed the door on his conscience. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he summoned the royal guards, the golden embroidery of his sleeves catching the dimming light of the hall. "Take this fellow," Ahab commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rasp, "and put him in prison. Feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I return in peace." It was a sentence of slow starvation, a calculated attempt to break the man who would not bend. The guards closed in, their iron grip a physical manifestation of the state's power over the individual. Yet, as they began to drag Micaiah away from the shimmering luxury of the throne room, the prophet did not look like a defeated man. His leaner frame remained steady, and his eyes held a piercing, final clarity that made the surrounding courtiers flinch. He stopped at the threshold of the great hall, turning back to face the broad-shouldered king one last time. The chilling warning he uttered was not a threat, but a sovereign seal upon the king's fate. "If you ever return in peace," Micaiah declared, his voice ringing with a weight that made the ivory walls seem to tremble. "The Lord has not spoken by me." He then looked past the king to the silent, watching assembly and added, "Listen, all you people." It was his final act of courage, a public stake in the ground. As the heavy doors of the dungeon groaned shut, Micaiah was left in the dark with his God, while Ahab remained in the light, marching toward a peace that would never come. The sun rose over the valley of Ramoth-Gilead, glinting off the iron chariots and the scales of thousand-man legions. Yet King Ahab felt a coldness that no desert heat could thaw. Micaiah's final chilling warning echoed in the chambers of his mind, a persistent drumbeat beneath the clamor of war. Driven by a desperate, lingering fear that he could outmaneuver the divine, Ahab turned to King Jehoshaphat with a plan born of cowardice and cunning. "I will disguise myself and go into battle," he declared, his voice tight with a rigid, forced confidence. "But you wear your royal robes." In a final act of royal defiance, the broad-shouldered king stripped away his deep purple robes and laid aside his golden crown. He exchanged his ornamental clasps for the dented, anonymous armor of a common soldier, attempting to dissolve into the ranks of his own infantry. He believed that by shedding the visual markers of his identity, he could hide from the divine judgment Micaiah had promised. His posture remained dominant, but his eyes darted with the restlessness of a hunted man. As the chariots roared into the fray, Ahab stood as a shadow among men, a king masquerading as a servant in a system built on lies. He watched from behind a borrowed shield as the Syrian captains, instructed to target only the king of Israel, swarmed toward the royal robes of Jehoshaphat. For a moment it seemed his strategic boldness had won. He was invisible, a ghost in the machine of war. But while he had successfully deceived the eyes of men, the lying spirit he had welcomed into his court was leading him toward a destiny that no disguise could avert. The stage was set for the final outcome, where the truth of a humble prophet would find its mark. The battle raged with a mindless fury, a chaotic storm of iron and shouting where kings and commoners bled alike into the dust of Ramoth-Gilead. Amidst the swirling madness, an unnamed Syrian soldier drew his bow, not at a specific target or a royal crest, but simply at random. He released the string, sending a lone arrow whistling through the heat-shimmered air. It was a shot born of chance in the eyes of men, but it carried the unerring weight of divine judgment. The shaft found the narrowest of gaps in Ahab's armor, piercing the king between the joints of his harness. Ahab, the man who had tried to hide from God behind a soldier's disguise, felt the sudden cold sting of the end. He propped himself up in his chariot, facing the Arameans as his lifeblood slowly pooled on the floorboards, staining the wood as the sun began to set. No amount of royal defiance or strategic deception could stem the flow. As the light faded from the sky, the life faded from the king. and a cry went through the host. Every man to his city, and every man to his country. The word of the humble prophet, once mocked and imprisoned, had found its mark more surely than any arrow. Micaiah's truth stood vindicated on the silent battlefield, proving that while kings may disguise themselves, they can never outrun the voice of the Almighty. The lying spirit had done its work, and the man who refused to be bought was revealed as the only one who truly saw. If you found this journey through Micaiah's fearless stand for truth inspiring, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful, untold stories of faith and courage to life through cinematic animation. Join our mission today.